Okay, that's past by my clock. A couple of people just joining at the moment, so we'll let them join. Welcome to this Northeast Scotland John Muir Trust local group talk. At this stage, most people will be more than familiar with Zoom, so I'm not going to say much. We do ask that you stay muted. You can have the camera on or off. We are recording. We'll be turning off the chat for the duration of the talk, but we'll use it after the talk for any questions that people may have for the speaker. They can either send them to the chat to everybody or to me, Donald, and I will read them provided they're straightforward. If they're not straightforward, then I might ask the individual to ask the question themselves. Okay, I will hand you over to tonight's chairman, James.
Okay, thanks, Donald. As Donald mentioned, this evening's talk is organised by the volunteers of the John Muir Trust North East Scotland group. We try and host 2 such events each year, so this would be the spring event. Very pleased tonight to have speaking for us Elspeth Berry. Elspeth classifies herself as an ultra endurance runner, and I know she's run in various places around the world, but especially in Europe and obviously the UK. The West Highland Way, which took me 6 days to walk, very leisurely, I must admit, Elspeth has run in less than 24 hours. So that's presumably where the ultra endurance comes in. But then she's also run the Watershed of Scotland, the divide between water flowing to the west and water flowing to the east. There is no path on the watershed. It's just a geographical, topographical line from the border with England to the north coast of Scotland. So she ran that Elspeth ran that in 2015, and I believe she's still the only female to have actually run that route. It's been walked before, but never run by a lady before. If that wasn't ultra enough, in 2019, after I suspect quite a bit of planning, she ran the Kungsleden route, or the King's Way in Sweden, which is 440 some kilometers, I think, but Elspeth will tell us more about that. And that too must be ultra endurance, whatever the classification is. So Elspeth is going to speak very shortly. At the end of it, we'll come back to Ross Brannigan, who's the engagement officer with John Muir Trust in Scotland. And at that stage, Donald will open up the Q&A and we'll be able to pose some questions to Elspeth. And I'm sure we'll have many. I've already got 2 anyway. So without much more ado, I'll hand over to Elspeth Berry. Elspeth.
Hi, so I hope you can see me, and more importantly, I hope you can see my slides already. Great, I've got a thumbs up. Well, thank you very much for tuning in. It's a great honour to be invited to speak for you this evening. I'm looking forward to sharing my experiences of my Kungsleden run with you. But I'd like to start by telling you a bit about the many races and adventures that I did that took me to the start of my Kungsleden journey. I began ultra running in 2011 when my cousin Kirsty asked if I'd like to run a race in the Alps. It was part of the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc series, and she could get us places for the baby race, which starts in Courmayeur in Italy, runs through Champex in Switzerland, and finishes in Chamonix in France. With a distance of 60 miles and 6,000 meters of ascent, they were just numbers I could not get my head around. So I naively accepted the place. This is a photo just showing really what a spectacular route it is. And my cousin and I were proudly sporting our finisher's gilet. I somehow managed to shuffle my way through to the race, but I have to admit, if the finisher's gilet had been anything other than turquoise, I'm not sure I would have managed. Turquoise is my favorite color, so that was a huge incentive to get to the end. It was a baptism of fire, but I finished the race addicted to ultra running. In 2013, my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I was desperate to do something useful or something helpful. So I decided to do some fundraising for a Glasgow charity, for the Parkinson's charity called Funding Neuro. I entered the West Highland Way race, which runs the 95 miles from Mulgai to Fort William along a rugged and undulated trail. As well as spectacular scenery, you're also required to have a support crew, and this made the race a lot of fun. So that's my mum and my aunt and my husband on the left side of the photo. They deserve a bit of introduction as well. I loved having the support crew and the encouragement from them, and I'd like to think that they enjoyed it too, although there have been some stories that have emerged over the years which suggested the operation wasn't quite as slick as I had thought it was. In case you haven't guessed, I love running. I think it's a perfect pace to see new places, and it's certainly taken me places I wouldn't have been otherwise. In 2015, inspired by Peter Wright, who wrote the book Ribbon of Wildness, I ran the Watershed of Scotland. It was another fundraising opportunity, and again, I chose to run for Funding Neuro. It took me 34 days to cover the 660 odd miles, which included 44 Munros and an infinite amount of bog. I had a huge number of people supporting me, friends and family, as well as friends of friends. And it was so lovely to have so many people who were willing to join me. The support of others has been massively encouraging and motivating to me. My mum in particular has been a tower of strength. Despite never having been a runner herself and openly questioning me at the start of a race, why on earth I'd want to make myself suffer so much. She's been there for most of my races and challenges. In 2018, Mum had a stroke quite out of the blue. And although she's made an amazing recovery, it has left her quite disabled. This gave me another reason to want to do some fundraising, and I chose to run for Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland. It also seemed an appropriate reason to try a solo adventure. I think I just wanted to make my life even harder. I was looking for a trip that would take me about 10 days, and I thought it would be feasible to cover 50 kilometres every day. I found a newspaper article which boasted 10 of the best long distance walking routes from around the world. The Kungsleden seemed to fit the bill nicely. Unlike the American trails, there was no fierce wildlife which would try to eat me, although the small print did not mention the insects. The Kungsleden, or King's Trail as it translates, opened in the early 20th century to create a tourist route into Lapland. And you can see from this diagram just where it's placed in Sweden. It's passable by foot and boats in the summer and can be skied in the winter. It covers around 450 kilometres across 4 of Sweden's national parks, so I figured I could do this in 9 days. The elevation varies from 30 metres above sea level to 1,150 metres, so it goes through alpine terrain as well as low-lying mountain birch forest. Although it's a very popular route, you can see it's very remote. It doesn't go through any major towns and just a couple of small villages. At the time I decided to run this, I found it hard to find a guidebook in English. And eventually I came across a plan and go book by Danielle and Wayne Fenton. I put all my faith in them. And I chose to start in the south and run north, largely because that's what they did. But it did also mean that my maps would be orientated the right way round for my trip. The most northerly section is also the most popular, so I felt I was leaving the best to the last. The route is partly served by the Swedish Tourist Association, or STF huts. Most people choose to take between 3 and 4 weeks to cover the Kungsleden, so they're required to carry camping gear to get so they have somewhere to stay between the huts. I didn't want to carry any extra gear than was necessary, so I decided I'd run between the huts, but the spacing wasn't ideal. On my 5th day, I'd have to run 65 kilometres. And although that seemed a reasonable distance, the lack of daylight options was terrifying. To add to my anxieties, there are 7 compulsory lake crossings. Each of these is served with 3 rowing boats. So if you arrive at a lake and there's 2 rowing boats, you're in luck. You can paddle across and carry on your merry way. But if you arrive and there's only 1 boat, then you have to paddle across, tether one of the boats on the far side to your own boat, go back to where you started and leave a boat there, and then you can paddle across. This means up to 12 kilometres of rowing. Thankfully, 6 of the crossings also have motorboats, but these run at fixed times and generally only once a day. All of the motorboats are based on the north shore of each lake, and for that reason alone, if you're considering doing this Kungsleden, I would start in the north, because then when you arrive at a lake, you can potentially track a skipper down and negotiate an extra crossing. But for me, I had to plan my trip around these fixed times as much as possible. And not knowing what the trails would be like or how long really it would take me to run between the lakes, that was terrifying too. I set off on the 15th of July, 2019, with my husband Tom following me for the first 5 kilometres. He was then going to be travelling back to Glasgow, where he'd watched my progress on my spot tracker. I made the mistake of weighing my bag at the start and was horrified to realise it was 10 kilos. I had been trying to train with a heavier pack, but I really hadn't appreciated how heavy it was going to be with a couple of days of food, a few toiletries, a charge pack, an emergency biv bag, as well as a change of clothes. As I started shuffling along, I was mentally emptying my bag, trying to work out what I could give Tom to take back. I ended up giving him a spare jacket, my cup, half a towel, and my toothbrush handle, which I'm sure made all the difference. Before I'd left home, I'd spent a while trying to decide which bag I was going to take, and eventually chose to run with a 20-litre on-pack. Not because I needed the size, it wasn't full at all, but it's a really lightweight bag. You can also take the support for the back out of it and use it as a sleeping mat. So should I end up having to camp outdoors, at least have that little bit of insulation. Unfortunately, it's such a generic bag that it's slightly big for me, so it was going to chafe my shoulders. So I had to buy a new t-shirt with a collar to avoid my shoulders being chafed to bits. I'd given myself a deadline to finish each day by 4 o'clock. There was no need for this, but I think in my head, I thought if I were to have an accident, it was more likely that somebody would pass me earlier on in the day. I was also really worried about the huts. What if I would arrive there and they'd be closed? Or I arrived and they were full? I had been told, and I'd read on blogs saying that the wardens are obliged to find people space to stay, even if there's no beds left. But I just couldn't fathom how this was going to work. I tried to focus on all the good things. The weather was perfect for running. It was mild and it was clear. And you can see the spectacular valley that I ran through on my first day. It's a lovely, well-trodden trail, a little bit rocky and a little bit of climbing, exactly the sort of terrain that I like to run through. I slowly adjusted my mindset from running for what I'd expected would be around 6 hours a day to near 8 hours. It was really hard to try and pace myself to know what I could cope with and still be able to run for 9 consecutive days. Even at this stage, I started worrying about all the teething problems. My bag seemed to be rubbing my back. My ankles started hurting. I was very relieved when I arrived at the first hut. I met a very friendly warden who, like most Swedes, speaks impeccable English. I asked about the etiquette for staying in huts and explained I hadn't stayed in one before. And he looked dubiously at my relatively small bag and asked if I'd been camping up until this point. I explained I'd run all the way from Hemavin, and he looked shocked. As it turns out, the hut was full, but of course he found me space in a bunk room and put a mat down for me. I'd already gained some infamy, and my roomies asked if I was the woman who'd run all the way from Hemavin. People's surprise about what I had done that day did make me question the scale of my challenge. I wondered what they all knew about the Kungsleden that I didn't. Most of the STF huts are basic and have no running water or electricity. They do, however, have gas and cooking utensils, as well as bedding. Guests take turn in filling and emptying buckets for the kitchen from nearby rivers or lakes. Most have a basic shop, and it's here I was planning on resupplying every day or every other day. It was hard to know what I'd be able to buy from there, however, and even by Swedish standards, the shop was eye-wateringly expensive. As well as these shelters, there are some emergency shelters along the way, but without a stove to cook my dinner and just a very thin insulated sleeping bag, I don't think I would have been very comfortable if I'd had to stay in one of these. On finishing my first day, I duly sent my automated tracker message to Tom so that he'd know I had arrived at my first hut safely. Unbeknown to me, he didn't receive that message, and it looked to him on the tracker site that I had stopped 10 kilometres short of where I told him I was planning on getting to. Luckily, he didn't do anything about it, since as it happens, I was safe. But when I found out a few days later that the tracker wasn't working properly, I was so annoyed to have yet more extra grams in my bag that I didn't need. To be fair, the tracker actually did an okay job after that of keeping people informed as to where I was on the Kungsleden, but my confirmation messages at the end of each day never arrived. My second day should have been a bit more relaxing now that I knew what to expect, but I had to collect a key for the hut that I'd be staying in that night from a village 10 kilometres short of the hut itself. The plus side of this was that I was collecting the key from a village, and a village meant a bigger shop. So I had a nice time shopping there and stocking up. As I wasn't really too sure what I'd be able to get in the huts, but I was desperate to not have anything extra in my bag, I did silly things like buy a packet of instant coffee and immediately throw half of it in the bin because instant coffee weighs so much. It was nice to be able to pick up some bread from this shop. I don't really know what I thought I would be eating during the day. Fresh food was never going to be an option. But to go by what's sold in the huts, it seems that most people cook their lunch, as noodles and meatballs are the favourites. I couldn't even get muesli for my breakfast, so I ended up eating a lot of Ryvita and squeezy cheese. Just not ideal from a calorific point of view. And come to think of it, it's not really ideal at all. I successfully managed to collect the key and continued on my way. The Kungsleden path is really well marked. The painted rocks to mark the summer trail, and for the winter trail, there are posts with red crosses on top, so they'll stick up above the snow. I hadn't really appreciated where there would be overlap, however, and during the afternoon, I started to panic as I realised I hadn't seen any painted rocks and only seen the tall posts. This could potentially mean that I'd be taken to the edge of a lake that didn't even have a rowing boat to get across. I started backtracking. I started trying to work out where I was on the map, but I couldn't work out those overlap, and eventually got my phone out, which had a basic map and route on it, and convinced myself that I was going the right way. This was the only time I had problems on the route, and then after realising that there is a good bit of overlap, I was much happier for the rest of the trip. I should say the Swedish maps are excellent, and they're entirely unnecessary for navigation in the Kungsleden, but they're very durable and light. They make a good fan. They're also waterproof, so they can be used as a mat to sit on. They're very crushable and can be squashed into tiny pockets. They make our OS maps look pretty clunky, in fact. So this is a couple of the trail markers. They're very well marked throughout the way, and the paths are really well maintained, even in the most remote sections. This bridge isn't actually an example of one of the better bridges. There's some very, very impressive large bridges over some of the rivers. And I love these wooden paths over the bogs. I didn't even have to get my feet wet. If only someone had thought to put these across some of the watershed when I ran that in Scotland. Day 3, I was more in my stride, but I'd had a bad night. To stay in the huts, you're supposed to carry a sheet sleeping bag. But as I was already carrying an emergency insulated sleeping bag, I didn't want to have a sheet sleeping bag as well. I hadn't really appreciated how hot the huts might be at night though, and it was far too hot to sleep in the sleeping bag that didn't have a zip. So I ended up having to lie on top of it. Needless to say, I hadn't packed any pajamas, so I just had to lie on top of the sleeping bag in my underwear. And I'd like to think nobody in the bunk rooms noticed, but I can tell you this, the insects did, and they had a feast. The mosquitoes were awful. Even during the day, the insects hounded me. I should have, for at least some of the time, been above the tree line, but it was unusually still for most of my trip. So the mosquitoes and the horseflies as well followed me to the top of all the passes. On the plus side, they did keep me moving. Day 4 included 2 of my boat trips, and the only one where I'd have to row. It's only a 500-metre row, but I was so worried about it. I couldn't even visualise if I'd be able to see across to the other side of the lake where I'd be rowing to. I worried all morning. But when I got to the lake, there was a man who was just tying up the boats, having paddled across. He was able to offer me some advice and encouragement, and there were 2 boats there, so I was only going to have to paddle across once. You can see they even provide life jackets for Kungsleden travellers, and they're tucked in a box beside the rowing boats. It was nothing to worry about, shockingly. Having managed this, I had plenty of time to get to the next lake where I'd be meeting a motorboat. I had a sizable pass to cross, and as I was trudging up, staring at my feet, I had glanced up to see how near I was to the top, and I got the fright of my life to see an enormous pair of eyes bearing down at me. The owner of the eyes also got a fright. I leapt back, and for a moment I saw this magnificent silhouette of an elk on the skyline. Sadly, this was the only exciting bit of wildlife spotting that I did on my trip. I did see a dead lemming, and although it was interesting seeing that close up, it wasn't quite so spectacular as the elk. Kungsleden has much impressive wildlife, including reindeer and the elk, and bears, wolves, wolverine, and lynx. I'd love to see all these animals in their natural habitat, but I have to say I was equally nervous at the prospect. There's still a traditional practice of reindeer herding by some Sami communities in Lapland, but I didn't see any evidence of this either. I'd been advised that all wildlife would likely keep out my way, but that I might be able to smell a bear. And there was one river path that I was running along, and I smelled a really musty, warm, fusty sweatiness, and I wondered if it was a bear. I'll never know, but in all likelihood, it was probably me by this point in my journey. I did try to wash myself and my clothes every day in a river or lake. It was quite important at least to rinse my clothes as they were encrusted in salt, and this caused me more chafing problems. My socks in particular were deadly. I'd only taken 2 pairs for my trip, and try as I might to clean them every night, I couldn't get the grit out of them. My feet are normally okay when I'm running, and I don't tend to get blisters, but the dampness and the grit in my socks chafed and rubbed them, and they ended up bleeding and blistered. They actually looked like they were rotting. Thankfully, I packed a little pot of Sudocrem, and that worked wonders. Not only did it prevent much further chafing, but its antiseptic properties helped my feet heal as well. Day 5 was my 65-kilometre day, and it was also the day that I'd be crossing the Arctic Circle, so there would be no hint of darkness after this. Whilst that made things much easier, it did make me think I'd like to go back and experience the Kungsleden in the winter and see the Northern Lights. As it was, I was up at 6 a.m. The sun was already high in the sky. It was warm. It was hard to know what the weather would be like before I left Scotland. I knew it could be freezing in the north, but I knew it could be in the 20s during the day. I saw an unseasonably warm spell in the high 20s for nearly the entire time and very little wind for most of my journey. As someone who's usually cursed with bad weather, this was phenomenal. But if I had to complain, it would be the dry bag that I carried in my rucksack that I didn't open for my entire trip, containing my down jacket, hat, gloves, buff, and my waterproof trousers. It was pretty glorious, though, to be able to run in minimal kit, as you can see I'm running in there. Though you can also see I was wearing my midget as I was running too. I have to say, I started to worry that my poor Scottish skin wasn't going to be able to cope with so much sun. After 45 kilometres, I met a hiker, and as there are not many people around, we stopped to have a chat and discussed where we'd come from and where we were going. She was horrified when I said I was still had a good 20 kilometres to get to the next lake, and she told me I wouldn't make it. I got ridiculously upset about this, and it really spoilt my afternoon and made me panic all the more. I can't believe I let somebody else's judgment get to me like this. It was ridiculous to think that she knew my capabilities better than I did. Of course, I made it to the lake, and it wouldn't have mattered if it had taken me longer than I thought, because I'd been in touch with the skipper the day before. I'd explained where I'd be running from and that I was running for charity, and she assured me that she would wait for me. Nonetheless, I was glad that I didn't keep her waiting, and I was really happy to have someone to chat to as we crossed the lake. The boat took me to the village of Kvikjok, and here there's a mountain station. Now, this is a step up from an STF hut. It's got electricity, a big shop, and a restaurant. I did a sweep of the shop, but there was a queue and it seemed to be so slow. I was pretty exhausted and starving. I'd had to tuck into a lot of my food whilst I was queuing to pay for it. When I finally got to the front of the queue, I asked about using the washing machine, but I was told it wouldn't be available until 9 p.m. I was hoping I'd be fast asleep by then, so that wasn't an option. I asked about dinner, but I was told they would stop serving in 10 minutes. And in telling me this news, the woman serving me took as long as possible to get my room key. I took my key and had to run straight to the restaurant. It was probably one of the most expensive meals that I've ever eaten, and sadly I couldn't enjoy it. I was just so tired, I was starting to feel ill. I did enjoy the shower that I was able to have that evening though. A hot shower, it was such a treat. I was able to wash my clothes in a bucket, and even this was a step up from washing them in a lake or a river because I wasn't attacked by insects whilst I did it. Most luxurious of all was the bed with bed sheets. I had to pay £9 to hire them, but it was worth it every penny, knowing that I'd be safe from the mosquitoes at night. Day 6 was a relatively short day at just 40 kilometres, and I couldn't decide if I'd earned a lie-in or if I was going to be so tired from the previous day that I'd need to get an extra early start. As it was, none of my days started particularly quickly. I had an intensive skincare regime to take care of, far more comprehensive than my skincare regime at home. I had to start with Sudocrem on all my raw skin that had been rubbed by my bag and my clothing. Then was the sun cream, then the mosquito repellent. Then I had to use an aloe vera lip balm on all my current bites. And then I had to treat my feet. They were slathered in Sudocrem, blister plasters applied in appropriate places, and I also used some sterilised sheep wool to prevent further rubbing. Then I had an uninspiring breakfast of Rivita with squeezy cheese and an instant coffee, and that was me on my way. On this particular morning, I ran through trees, and it was nice to be able to shelter a little bit in the morning. Imagine a Scot having to say that. In the afternoon, I climbed another pass, and as I got to the top, the most spectacular view opened up with the mountainous Skearf. Its impressive cliff face falls from the top 1,000 metres down to the lake. It's a popular add-on to the Kungsleden, and I was sad that I wasn't going to have time to do that. But again, it made me marvel at my luck with the weather. It really was special. I'm sure many a hiker has got to this point in the Kungsleden and seen nothing more than clouds for days on end. I arrived at the lake with 2 hours to wait for the boat. It was so nice and warm. I had a long swim in the lake and I was able to do my washing here. And then I left my washing on the handrail for the pier to dry. By the time the boat arrived, there were 17 people waiting to get on it, and I was slightly self-conscious picking my underwear off the handrail. The skipper was fairly fierce and insisted we all got in the boat, although I'm fairly sure it wasn't designed for that number of people. But she assured us that on such a calm day, it would be fine. I wasn't going to argue since I did not fancy the row across. The boat took us to the hut of Axe, and it was a really busy hut, and it felt like a hub. It was really nice to have lots of people to chat to. It was such a social evening. I was almost tempted to buy a beer from the shop, but I was sure that if I could wait till the end of my journey, it was going to taste all the better. I rehydrated my freeze-dried food, but one of the best things about being in a busy hostel is there were some people who'd rather over-catered, and I was able to finish off their enormous pot of pasta and tuna, which was much more like it. The following day, I had to take 2 boats and a bus. There's a section of the Kungsleden that runs through a narrow valley, and there's no trail here, so there's no option but to take a bus 30 kilometres along the route. At least there was other hikers from Akse Hut who were aiming for the same first boat as me, so I felt confident I would catch that and enjoyed the run to get there. To get to the second boat, I was a bit more anxious. Along the way, I met another runner, and as we're a very rare breed on the Kungsleden, we stopped for a chat. It was only a few days later, I realised through Facebook that we had a good friend in common, and it was such a shame that we hadn't known that at the time, because it would have been nice to have chatted for longer. The lake has a mountain station at the edge of the shore, so I arrived in good time for the boat. And being a mountain station, there was a shop here, so I had a much better selection of food. I was particularly excited to be able to get some fresh fruit. I had another swim and another wash of my clothes, but since there was quite a few people around, I decided I wouldn't let my washing waft around in the wind and instead packed it into my bag wet. On crossing the lake, I got ridiculously panicky about the bus at the other side. I had my compass out to check that the bus was going in the right direction. Of course, it was an uneventful trip, and I arrived at the next hut at Watershed at 5:30 in the evening. Here I had another decision to make though. I could stay at Watershed hut, or I could go run another 15 kilometres to the next hut. But just before the next hut, there's a 1 kilometre lake crossing. If I got there and discovered I'd have to paddle across 3 times, I think that really would spoil my day. So I decided to wait at Watershed and make the following day that bit longer. It was a very long evening, worrying about whether I'd maybe made the wrong decision. I had to get up super early to make sure that I'd catch the 7 a.m. boats the following morning. I arrived at the lakeshore at 6:57 and had 3 minutes of horror, worrying whether I'd missed the boat or not. I can't tell you how good it was to hear the sound of the engine. I could have hugged the skipper. I have to say it was a rare cloudy and windy morning, and I really think I would have struggled to paddle across, so it was just as well he was there to take me back across the lake. The best bit about this boat crossing, it was actually the last of the boat crossings, and now I had 2 days to run 105 kilometres. Surely I could relax. The cloud lifted and it turned into another spectacular day. My strength and fitness had built, and it was, I didn't have much climbing to do in this particular morning, so it was a very runnable stretch, and it felt really wonderful to be able to keep going despite my heavy bag. I was really enjoying myself and perhaps not paying quite enough attention to where I was putting my feet, and I tripped and launched myself across the path. I smacked my knee on a rock, and I was horrified to see this orange goo coming out of it. I've never seen anything like this before, so I assumed I'd done something pretty bad. I sat for a few moments feeling pretty sorry for myself and realised I should get my first aid kit out my bag. Now, this first aid kit is actually just a Ziploc bag that I filled for my first ultramarathon in 2011. I don't think I've ever opened it since then, and it might have been an idea to check it before I went on the Kungsleden. It contained a few diarrhea tablets that had escaped from their casing. I did find an antiseptic wipe, but it had completely dried up beyond any use, and there were some plasters that had entirely lost their stick. This did nothing to make me feel any better. I could say I hadn't done any real harm, so I got up and shuffled on. The next people I met on the trail were 2 young men who could see that I was really upset and could see that my knee was bleeding. They sat me down and washed my knee with their drinking water. They were very excited to get their brand new first aid kits, which had never been opened, out of their bags. Of course, the first thing they were able to offer me was some more diarrhea tablets, but I assured them I was okay for those. They did at least have antiseptic wipes and a plaster that stuck to my knee. This made me feel a lot better. However, I was still feeling a bit sorry for myself, and as I passed a few other people along the way, people kept stopping to check that I was all right, and this would only make me cry again. I met a British couple, and I explained to them that in the last week I'd run over 350 kilometres, and I was really desperate to get to Abisko the following day because I was going to be meeting my family there, and I was running for charity. They were so kind to me. The women gave me a hug, and they told me if I stopped at Singy Hut, they would cook my dinner and run around after me. That was certainly a very tempting offer. I continued on my way, and I arrived at Singy Hut 3 hours after I had fallen. As my knee was still bleeding, I was really concerned I needed a stitch. I found the warden, and as luck would have it, she's actually a nurse. I told her my sob story through tears, that I was running for charity, a stroke charity in particular, and my mum, who had a stroke, was going to be coming to see me at the end. And I travelled so far already, and now I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to get to the end. She said she felt quite emotional listening to my tale. It was pretty impressive on taking the plaster off that she managed not to laugh. As she told me, it's actually just a cut and it's really nothing to worry about. She was very kind with how she said it, and she gave me a hug and told me to go and eat some chocolate, and that really cured me. Although it was already 5 p.m, past my arbitrary curfew that I had set myself, I decided to carry on. It meant I wouldn't have my dinner cooked for me, and it also had the highest point of the trail to cross, the Tiaktia Pass, at 1,150 metres. But I really did feel relaxed by this point and confident that I was going to be able to stay in the hut that evening when I arrived there. And it also made a difference that there was quite a few more people on this section, it being the more popular section. I had a lovely time, and this ended up being my favourite section of the Kungsleden. Of course, I couldn't really do any running because my deep knee did hurt at this point, but that meant I had time really to appreciate my surroundings, and it was magnificent, especially from the top of the pass where I'm standing in this photo. Passing people, they could all see my knee was bleeding, and people were still kind and stopped to check, but I could confidently assure them, nothing to worry about, it is just a cut. When I arrived at the next hut, Tiakstugen, 15 hours after I had started my day, 2 wardens there saw me arrive and saw my knee bleeding and insisted that I sat down. When I told them where I'd started that morning, they insisted that I go into their private kitchen where they made me some tea and gave me some cake. What a treat. That felt like a real result. I really enjoyed chatting to them that evening and hearing about the work that they do for the Swedish Tourist Association. I then had to go out for one of the more refreshing baths of my trip. My final day was a mere 48 kilometres, and you're not going to believe it. After all my worries, I decided I would get an extra boat. It would save me 5 kilometres of hobbling, and I felt because my knee was a little swollen, yes, I'm drawing this out, what a drama queen, I deserved that extra little bit of help. It was another beautiful morning, and the gentle descent down to the lake was really glorious. I made it to the hut with time to get a few treats from the shop before getting on the boat, and again admire the beautiful valley I was travelling in. The more I descended, the more mountains seemed to appear through valleys, and again I marvelled at my luck with the weather. There was a bit of a breeze that day, so I got to sport my new jacket, and that made my bag just a little bit lighter. One of the big advantages of having such good weather was that I hadn't had to faff with kit at all. Normally on a run, I'd be stopping and taking my jacket on and off, finding my hat, finding my gloves, putting them back again, maybe deciding to put waterproof trousers on, but I didn't have any of this, and I'm sure that saved me quite a lot of time over the course of my 9 days. I was buzzing as I started the final kilometres. So I kept tripping as I was so tired, and I had to keep reminding myself to pick my feet up. A kilometre from the end, I met my Swedish friends who travelled up from Stockholm to meet me, and Alba, their 6-year-old daughter, ran the last kilometer with me. It was really wonderful to get to the finish and be able to sit down guilt-free and know I didn't need to worry about anything. My parents and my aunt were there too to meet me. Eventually, we hobbled up to the mountain station where I had my first beer in 9 days, and it did taste truly wonderful. I was able to have a hot shower, and my parents and aunt had brought me some clean clothes, which was a real treat. We had a champagne picnic outside the mountain hut as well. The Kungsleden is a spectacular route. As I said before, I'm normally cursed with bad weather, and I will never get over the 9 days of blue skies and sunshine that I had. I'm sure there hasn't been a weather window like this for decades. To see all the mountaintops in each section in their full glory was so lucky. I'm surprised at the things that made my trip so tough. I knew a solo adventure was going to be hard, but it was more than loneliness. I'd had so much self-doubt all the time. I did get through 5 audiobooks along the way, but as they're not interactive, they weren't so much of a comfort to me. Patting myself on the back and self-belief aren't things I'm good at. Although on paper I felt confident that my challenge was possible, I found lots of reasons to doubt myself along the way. I hope that if I were to try something like this again, I'd be able to relax and enjoy every moment, feeling proud of what I'm able to achieve. I'm very grateful to Crawford White at Project 3 for his coaching and his belief in me, and also to Tom and my parents for their encouragement. It was phenomenally rewarding to raise over £3,000 for Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, Elspeth, wow, that was a fantastic story. I'm exhausted, I'm excited, and my knee hurts like nobody's business. What a fantastic story. So Donald will be opening the chat now, so look forward to some questions coming in. I'll be putting in a couple, but whilst that's going on, we submit the questions. I'm going to hand over to Ross Brannigan. Ross is a staff member of John Muir Trust, not a volunteer. He's the staff member and he's the engagement officer for the charity. So he'll be able to tell us a little bit about what's going on within the charity itself. So Ross, if you want to take up the reins here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, James. And yeah, that was awesome, Elspeth. So brilliant to hear it, and fantastic photographs as well. And thanks to everybody who has come along tonight, and also to those who have donated, I should say. So I'm just going to give a very quick update on what the John Muir Trust has been up to, and what you have to look forward to in the next little while. So I'm going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Obviously, there's a lot that we could talk about, but I'm going to start by just talking about some of our work to restore some of our wild places, which is perhaps sort of like the peak of what we do. And I'm going to start in the south of the country and talk about our work in Glenridding and neighbouring Thirlmere. So the photographs that you see on the screen just now are some photos that I took a couple of weeks ago whilst I was out with Isaac, who is on the left holding that willow peg in his hands, and a number of our volunteers. And we're really excited to be involved in a new project with the Cumbria Wildlife Trust and United Utilities on the Thirlmere catchment area. Thirlmere is one of the main water reservoirs in the Lake District. It provides my water here in Kendal. Recently, United Utilities have been looking to improve water quality, improve their flood management, and also to increase biodiversity, which is a real key point for us. So the photographs that I've taken there are from the Wyveburn. Wyve translates to mean willow. And at the moment, I think, well, before we started planting, there were 3 willows in the Wyveburn. And due to that lack of tree coverage, they're not going to have as much soil stability. and also the water is going to run off very quickly. It's a very heavily grazed area, as you can probably see from the photographs. So we're now working with the local farmer who's reduced some of his stock and provided areas for us to do some tree planting, which is absolutely fantastic. So just in the past couple of months, we've planted over 400 trees, a bit of a mix of aspen, rowan, oak, willow, but that's only a third of what we've got planned to plant for this period. So we've got work parties every Tuesday and Thursday, I believe, at the moment, on Thirlmere. So if you are interested in that, pop onto our website and look for stories about Glenridding, and you'll probably see the opportunities that are there and be able to get in touch with Isaac to get along to one of those work parties. Briefly about Glenridding itself, we've also planted over 1,000 native broadleafs on Helvellyn, which is just superb. A lot of those are montane trees that have been grown on by our group of local growers, which is just a fantastic thing that people get involved with, and such green-fingered individuals who help us with doing really, really valuable work to restore a habitat that's largely gone from England's uplands in particular. So moving up the country, we'll look at Glenlude, which is a little forestry plantation just outside of Innerleithen. And there we've been removing a large number of diseased larch over the past few months. And we're now going to be starting a really big planting project this year. Basically, we're just planting trees in Glenridding, in Glenlude, sorry. So if you're looking to plant trees and you're in the sort of like central Scotland area, then have a look on our website and you'll see opportunities to do so at Glenlude. But last year we had 850 birch, willow and aspen that were planted out by our amazing volunteers, which is just superb. We're hoping to see some black grouse return to that area. As some of you will know, forestry plantations have quite a hard border to them, which doesn't allow for a nice habitat for black grouse and other species to be able to, breed and then to live and then find food. So really important work that's going on at Glenlude. Moving up the country somewhat, we're looking at Skye here. So on Skye, we're restoring 36 hectares of peatland that has been drained for forestry previously. We've removed around 1,000 tons of former plantation that was really providing quite poor timber because it was planted on such a wet peat bog area. And this project meant that we did have to close the car park at Blaven for a little while, but that has meant that we've been able to get in with the heavy machinery to take out the timber and start raising the water table to re-wet this really large area of peatland that has been drained and is now just basically emitting carbon, whereas this is part of our wider ambition to capture more carbon on our land. And also just improve biodiversity. If you do want to help with any of this, we're going to be launching a peatland appeal this year. So keep an eye out for that. If you're a member, you'll get it in the journal or the members news. And if you're not a member, then you can keep an eye on our website for details. And I would encourage you to become a member because it just goes straight back into helping us with this kind of work. Moving on from the kind of restoring habitats, we're looking at protecting and conserving the land that we already have. So hot off the press news, the Glen Shiro wind farm development that was proposing the installation of 39 wind turbines in the Monolith Mountains has just been rejected by Scottish ministers, which the Trust is really excited about. We rejected we participated in the public local inquiry back in November 2020. And basically the development would have seen 39 new turbines plus 28 kilometers of tracks built in the mountains, and we felt that was not a very great use of the landscape. Obviously the Trust isn't against wind turbines, but in this case this was going to be in a large area of wild land, and some of that will probably be on peatland as well. So we decided that it was definitely something we wanted to oppose, and very pleased to see that the decision has been made to reject it, which is great. On another note about planning and development, so a big story this year is the National Planning Framework number 4, which is a rather excitingly titled document. But this is really important because the NPF is what sets the groundwork, sets the framework for any development that's going to be taking place in Scotland, all the way up until 2045. So the Trust has responded to NPF 4 at the end of 2021, basically with a plea to have wild land areas included in the National Planning Framework, but you can also respond as well. So if you go onto the Trust website and click support us and then take action, you'll see what I've put on the screen there is have your say on a vision for Scotland in 2045. You have until the 31st of March to respond, and I would really encourage you to get involved with that. You know, sometimes consultations can seem quite boring, but this is a really important one to be involved with, so I would encourage you to do so. Moving on, I just want to say a big thank you to the seasonal rangers who helped us out last year. After the COVID lockdowns eased, we obviously saw a large influx of people coming to our sites in 2020, and that continued into 2021. So some funding from Nature Scot allowed us to hire 7 seasonal rangers over the summer, one of which is Lisa, who you can see in the photograph there. And they carried out surveys, litter picking, and did a lot of engagement with visitors. And we've done some research with the University of Cumbria, who've distilled some of that information we gathered through the surveys, and have, some anecdotal evidence so far has seen that we're seeing a changing visitor demographic to a younger audience coming in larger groups, and many of them influenced by social media. So just really interesting stuff coming out from it so far to bear in mind. And also I want to make a quick nod to the Junior Ranger programme. So this was a pilot scheme last year, and it saw 18 children from Lochaber and Ullapool Highs getting involved with some of our work at Nevis and Cúnaig. And they were just brilliant young people to have around. I worked with them myself at a couple of events last year, and they were so enthusiastic and passionate and just really keen to learn. So it was really good to see young people like that getting involved in conservation on their doorstep. They learned a lot about conservation, land management, and learned some essential skills for the outdoors. So we really hope to roll this out further in the years to come. And lastly, just sort of like a view on the horizon. We have a new strategic plan that is going to be sort of like creating our framework for the next few years. So just basically keep an eye out for that. It's not going to perhaps change anything that, you know, on a day-to-day basis for members, but for us, it's quite a big change and helps with the refocusing of our work. And yeah, perhaps we'll open up some exciting projects and new things for people to get involved with. So yeah, but that's everything from me. If anyone has any questions for me, please just give me a shout. But otherwise, I think we'll go back to the Q&A and ask Elspeth some questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Ross. It's always good to hear an update of what the Trust's been up to. It's somehow better hearing it spoken than the written word. The publications of the Trust are very informative. But anyway, as you say, let's get back to the Kungsleden and questions for Elspeth, which have been coming in. I will try and work my way through them. So first of all, James is asking about your fitness regime between big runs and in the lead up to a particular run.
So I did have a coach before Kungsleden, and I have had a coach for some of my bigger events, and it's all sort of been quite well managed that my biggest week will be sort of 3 weeks before an event. And when I say big week, we're probably like just converted to miles, but I think about 80 miles that I would run in a week. and then taper down. In general, I run about 50 miles a week, split with one bigger run and then 4 or 5 shorter runs, ideally with a hill session and a speed session as well.
Okay, there's a question about your motivation. Were you addicted to ultra runs back in 2011? And had you done much trail running before that?
I had done quite a lot of trail running and quite a few hills. In fact, I'd done a lot of adventure racing before then, but that was all much shorter events. I really, really liked the simplicity. And I think that's really what got me, especially away from adventure racing. And I did do a bit of mountain biking before, but that's so faffy and I'm not very good at the technical, looking after my bike. So running is just so easy. And it was really, really amazing to run through the Alps, and see more long distance opportunities like that. Yeah, I really genuinely was addicted after that. I've done big races every year since then.
And also, how do you take care of your knees?
I don't want to speak too soon, but in general, I've been very lucky. I think actually it's a really good thing about trails. I mean, if I'm ever going to get sore legs, it's if I'm running on a lot of tarmac. Trails are much more forgiving because you're not pounding your feet at the same angle all the time. You have to use your ankles, and you really do vary the muscles that you use. Maybe it's an age thing, but I am more aware now that I'm having to do strength sessions, and that's actually a really important part of my training, whereas that hasn't been so much in the past.
Okay, your talk obviously will have inspired some people, and I'm particularly impressed that you consider a 10-kilogram pack is heavy. That would be very light by my standards, but I'm obviously not a runner. So 2 questions I'll put together on kit and, well, food and water actually. Did you carry water? How much and what weight? And then the food seemed quite variable en route. Did you plan a level of calorie intake? And if so, what was it?
Well, I'll start with water. So I carried a Camelback. I mean, that's slightly faffy to have to fill up. But well, actually mostly because of the bag that I was using, it wasn't going to be convenient to have little bottles, and the Camelback I could take 2 litres in, so I'd fill that up. And I must, there was one day certainly that I filled it up at least 2 times, just on a river along the way. So there wasn't a shortage of water. My 65-kilometre day, I did have an hour and a half or something without water, and I was starting to panic then. Because the trail happened to be quite high up, I didn't get an opportunity to fill. But yeah, you can imagine the weight of 2 litres of water. It's just that it wasn't 2 litres of water for very long, so it was drinking away. As for the food, yeah, I didn't plan how many calories I'd have. Mostly, I mean, it was just hard to know what I was going to be able to get. I mean, I'd read a bit in blogs about what might be available, and I'd assumed that I would start every day with sort of muesli or some sort of cereal, but I couldn't. And I just don't know what I thought was going to be available for lunch. But as I said, it wasn't really adequate. They did have jelly sweets, so that kept me going a lot of the time, and my rehydrated meals. But I think I was in calorie deficit for most of the trip.
Great. I'll read the next one. Did the terrain remind you of home? It looks very Scottish in nature. Alison's wondering if you knew about that and that influenced your decision on which trail to run.
I hadn't really anticipated that at all. I think, when I'd initially decided to do the Kungsleden, I didn't know what to expect. But yes, it did really remind me of Scotland, although like everything felt much bigger. Although the mountains aren't any higher than in Scotland, the valleys are so wide and spaced out. It felt a bit like Scotland that had been stretched out. And I think especially in the remoteness as well. But yeah, it did feel like home a lot of the time.
apart from perhaps the weather, you seemed very, very fortunate with the weather you had. We're
Yeah.
used to people showing blue sky pictures, but that's because they've chosen those days to show them. You deliberately had to show a day of some cloud pictures.
Yeah, yeah. It was hard to find one. Yeah.
Yeah. Very appreciative comment. Next, you mentioned insects that you encountered. Question about timing. Would the insects have been less a month later? And what would the weather have been like by
I
then?
think July and August are definitely the worst months for insects. I just didn't believe how bad that would be. But I mean, that was when I was available. That was when I had free time that I could go. So, it's no point in worrying about that. I think there's a little bit of time either side of that, in June into September. But the difficulty is, I mean, it can snow. And yeah, that's the reason for putting up with the insects, I suppose.
If you were to do it again, would you do anything differently?
I hope I'd be kind to myself and not worry so much.
With somebody else?
Sorry?
Would you go with somebody else?
That would definitely make it easier.
Another question on kit. Did you have a specific pair of trail running shoes or just regular running shoes? And I think I can probably answer the other one. Did you take a spare pair? I suspect not.
I only had 2 pairs of socks. I certainly wasn't going to have more shoes. I always wear Saucony Peregrines, which are trail running shoes, because I have slightly strange shaped feet and they fit me. Yeah, so I just keep buying the same ones. They're not perfect for all the terrain that I run in. I mean, I wear them for hill running as well, and they're definitely not grippy enough. But I've yet to find a pair that are quite right for my feet. So my Sauconys are good from that point of view.
I think you said you weighed your pack and that frightened you before you took stuff out. Did you weigh it again after you'd reduced it?
No, it didn't actually. Well, it wasn't an option to weigh it again. It just so happened there was scales in Hermafin.
Beth's asking whether you weighed yourself and whether you lost weight over the 9 days.
That's a really good question. I suspect I did. I stayed up in Abisko with my family for a few days and then went to Stockholm for another couple of nights, I think. So if I did lose any weight, rest assured I made up for it in the 5 days afterwards. So by the time I got back to Scotland, it was not noticeable.
And I think an inevitable question, what's your next big event?
Well, I actually haven't entered a big race just now, and I don't have, any serious plans brewing, but I have just joined the Lomond Mountain Rescue Team, and that's what I'm very excited about just now. I'm a trainee for the first year, so I can't go out on call outs for a year. But it's taking up quite a lot of my time, literally learning the ropes. Coming from a running background, I have strength and fitness on my side, but not much of the technical know-how yet.
I think there's always call for a hasty team to get somebody to a casualty.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's a place for you in that. Anyway, I think that is all of the questions that have come in. I apologize if I've missed anybody's questions, but I think that's been an excellent talk. So I'll give you my thanks for that, and I will hand you back to James.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Donald. And Elspeth, thanks very much indeed. It was a really enthralling and exciting talk. I could almost feel myself following behind you. Like I say, the pain in the knee was there, but you had so many different unknown challenges along the way, and you had so much self-doubt at times, and yet you did it. So you must have come away from that feeling absolutely super confident for anything you plan in the future, really. And I'm sure that is the case. I couldn't expect you to be so self-doubting again in your life. So it must have been a life-changing experience, and I think we're all very, very pleased to have heard about it. So thanks very much indeed for that.
Oh, thank you.
And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined in to listen to Elspeth's talk. I hope they've been as inspired as I have. And we obviously hope we'll bump into you again, Elspeth, in the future and learn of your latest adventures, but hopefully not carrying me off a mountain, because I really don't want to get to that stage. And so I'll wind up for the evening, unless Ross or Elspeth or Donald has anything else to say. And we will be organising another talk for the autumn. I've got nothing I can say more about that because there is nothing more to say at this stage. But we will be organising, and of course, John Muir Trust headquarters arrange various presentations during the course of the year. Certainly have been doing through COVID. So I'm sure Ross has something up his sleeve there that he will be announcing at some stage. But unless anyone has anything else to say.
I'll just say, if you enjoyed this talk and you do want to support the John Muir Trust, there'll be an email going around after this event to everybody who signed up with an opportunity to donate or become a member for a discounted rate. So yes, it'd be great to have your support.
Okay, I knew Ross would come in with that one. So, so anyway, thanks very much, everyone. So we'll sign off here, and hope to see you at one of the volunteer days, tree planting, or at another talk, either the main John Muir Trust talk or the Northeast Group talks in the future later this year. Have a great spring. Have a great summer. We'll see you in the autumn. Thanks very much indeed for tonight. Bye.